Morning, church. How's everyone doing? Great, good. So if you don't know who I am, I'm Steven, and I'm usually with the youth across the way. So I'm going to be with you guys this morning, and I'm going to be delivering this morning's message. But it's so funny to think like, okay, so usually on a Sunday morning, we typically run the same service or the same message or the same series as you guys do. But then making the jump over here, it's still like nuts to me how nerve-wracking it is. Like, I do this every Sunday. I know where the sermon's going. I know where the series is going. But yet to come over here, it's like this weird force field where it's like you step through and you're like, okay, you got to be really, really good. Or like you got to be really, really like whatever it is. And you'd be surprised how many times or how many sermons like all of us pastors preach. And usually it ends up being one of those sermons that we're just preaching to ourselves. Like, it's our hearts that we're like, okay, we got to nail this down for the congregation, but then we realize, like, okay, we're just really nailing this down for ourselves. Like, there's still so much room for us to grow in and so much room for us to, like, really understand and digest. And this is one of those sermons for me. It's like breaking it down. I'm like, okay, I'm just preaching to myself now. I'm just trying to get through this and like, kind of do all this thing with you. And so we've been in this series, which has been a really, really great series for the youth, and I'm sure it's been a really great series for us, but we've been in this series called Not a Fan, and we're in week 3 of it, and before I break down where we're going this morning, I kind of want to take a look back to where we've been, a little recap. And so we've been in this series, and if being a fan, like we don't want to be a fan, but if being a fan is someone who's just an enthusiastic admirer, where they want to, they want all the benefits. They want to be as close to the action as possible without putting any sacrifice in. If that's what a fan is, we're really asking the question to really do some self-reflection is are we just fans of Jesus? Like, is that really what we're aiming for, to just be admirers, people from afar, where we want all the benefits, but we don't want to put any of the sacrifice in? Is that really what we're aiming for? Is that really what we want? And so this is the thing that we're asking. And in week 1, we were going through it and we asked this question. It's like, okay, we need to stop for a second and really have a DTR, or something called defining the relationship. This is week 1. And defining the relationship is one of those conversations that when you're hanging out with that boy or with that girl, and you're friends, but then something happens where you're not just friends anymore. You're figuring things out, and there's this awkward stage of like, okay, you're like sending friends in. You're like, okay, find out if they like me. Like, I know I'm pretty good, but I need to know for sure before I make this next move. I need to know for sure if I make this next step. I mean, we're hanging out, but like, I think she likes me more than you. You're having those conversations like, okay, I need to figure out what this relationship is all about. I need to define where we sit. Where exactly are we? Are we just friends? Are we more than friends? We're not, okay, I was reading that wrong, but we'll continue just to be friends. I'll cry a little bit, but we'll be okay. And so we need to sit down and have this conversation with God. We need to sit down and have this conversation with our faith and really sit down and be like, okay, where is this at? What is our relationship, Jesus? If we sit down and we have this DTR and we're defining the relationship, where is my faith in you? How do you view me and how am I viewing you? And do those align? And so we can hide behind this title of Christian. We can hide behind this blanket statement of like, oh, I'm a Christian. But that's a loaded statement. It's like, what does that exactly mean? What does it mean to just be friends? I mean, is being a Christian one of those things where we do whatever is mostly comfortable for us? If being Christian is one of those things where we say, okay, this might not be the holiest thing, but it's not that bad because, well, I'm a Christian. I mean, Christian is one of those things that it's not so clearly defined in Scripture. In fact, we only find this word 3 times in there. And 2 out of the 3 times it's used by outsiders calling those who are Jesus followers. And so thinking of this, it's like, okay, are we just claiming this blanket statement of being a Christian, but yet we live our lives however we feel like? Or are we under this other title? There's something that's more clear. The thing that we know is how to define, and this thing called disciple. And this disciple, what it means to be a disciple is someone that says, listen, God, how would you handle these situations? Because that's how I want to handle them. God, how would you respond to someone who does this to you? Because that's how I want to respond. You see, when it comes to a disciple, it's something way more clear cut. There is no real, smoke and mirrors there. You know exactly where you sit with Jesus. You're following him. And you're asking these questions, okay, what is it that you're doing, God? Because that's what I want to do. So it's these titles of like, okay, if we're defining the relationship, What is this relationship? Are we just a Christian, or are we a disciple? Or to break it down even more, to put it a little more easy, are we a fan, again, this admirer of Jesus from afar, or are we a follower, someone who's close, that we can't get lost very easily? And so last week, we even took another step and we started asking, okay, so what are the roles of these rules that we hear about? Because again, looking on the outside, you can walk into any church, you can hear any sermon, and you hear, okay, there are these rules that we should be following. You should be doing this, and you shouldn't be doing those things. And so how do we follow these rules? What's the relationship to looking at these rules? And again, we think of, these rules of like, okay, if you follow the rules better, you're probably better with God. The more you know these rules, the more you know God. I mean, this is usually what we think of a good Christian as. Someone who can read their Bible, who knows their Bible, who will zealously share their Bible, who will be the first one to say, like, I want to pray. Or they want to go like, I'll give, and I'll give for everyone to see. I mean, I look at that list and I'm like, man, I want to know my Bible more. I want to share my Bible more. I want to be excited about sharing my Bible. I want to pray in front of all to see. I want to give for all to see. I want to do all those things. It's like, okay, is that what a good Jesus follower does? Or is that just what a Christian does? Well, the answer is, well, yes and no. Because you see, the rules, those aren't necessarily a bad thing. But when we make them everything, it gets a little muddy. When we make the rules, when we make it all about the rules, we lose sight of the rule giver. I mean, as a loving husband, I can do all of these things that my wife loves me to do. I can do the dishes, I can take out the trash, I can clean up after myself, I can make sure that I clean up the sink after shaving. I don't want to leave any hairs anywhere because, it's a pet peeve of hers. I can not eat the last piece of leftovers, or cannot eat the last piece of dessert without asking her first and making sure, like, hey, have you had enough before, like, just chowing it down or whatever? And I can look at all these rules, and at the end of the day, I can be like, hey, love, man, hasn't this been a great week for you? Yeah, it's been all right. Like, the dishes are done, the trash is out, there's no hair on the sink, you got some extra dessert, you got all those things. It's like, she's like, yeah. It's like, you know what that means? She's like, what? I'm like, you got to give me one of those back scratches. She's like, what? I'm like, and not one of those wimpy back scratches, but like you got to really dig in where it almost hurts me, and like where all the gunk gets under your fingernails. And like if you see those clogged pores, well, what you got. You got to unclog those clogged pores. and I'm like, she's like, no. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, don't you remember the list that I did for you? All the rules that I followed, all of those things? Like, wouldn't I be justified in saying, like, listen, I don't need to repeat what I just did. Like, you owe me all this stuff. Like, you owe me the best back scratch ever. And I already saw some wives being like, nuh-uh. Like, he wasn't serving me. He was serving himself. Like, and it's true. Like, when I think about that as a loving husband doing all of these acts, was I really serving my wife, or was I serving myself? And that's kind of a mirror of how our relationship can be with God when we make rules everything. That we look at all these rules and we say, okay, God, I'm following all these things. I'm doing everything right, reading my Bible, sharing it, going to church, paying my tithe, giving, volunteering, all of these things. But yet we haven't really created this relationship with God. All we're really saying is like, God, at the end of the day, look at all of these lists I've completed. And because I've completed those lists, don't you owe me something? And I think God would look at that situation and look at us and say, like, were you really serving me at that moment? Or were you serving yourself? When you look at all the rules and look at all the things that you should be following, again, rules aren't bad, but when the heart behind them, if it's just about serving me, it's a different story. Do you do all the things? Do you do all the rules? Do you follow all those things to serve God or to serve yourself? Again, looking at rules versus relationship. And understanding fan versus follower and rules versus relationship is really the groundwork of understanding where God is going to take us this morning and where he's going to take us through the rest of the series. Because looking at fan versus follower and rules versus relationship, those are some big jumps that can happen. And I truly believe that we can hesitate when it comes to following Jesus.
That making that jump from fan to follower can seem pretty big. Or even when we're really, really good and we're following all the rules and then we want to move to relationship, we're like, but this feels so comfortable. Knowing the rules and doing the rules and knowing how to behave and not to behave, that's easy. This relationship, that can seem really, really far. And so I get it. Understanding why God would want us to take us anywhere, that can be a difficult thing, and I think that's why we hesitate. It's like, God, you know certain things about me. You know that I'm all about rules. You know that I'm really, really far, though. Like, why would you want me? Why would you want to take me anywhere? And I look at verses like John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. You read in there that it's whoever believes. And then you go to Luke 9:23, and it says that whoever wants to follow me. Again, whoever, anyone. And when we say anyone, that means that it's open to everyone. And we push back to this idea. There's this, like, we hesitate. We don't want this to really be true because we say things like, God, you know, he doesn't really want someone like me in the church. I got too much stuff. Man, if I were to step inside of a church, it would burn up in flames. Man, I could be open to surrendering everything to God, but first I got to get all of these ducks in a row. First I got to sort this out. We say things like, man, if you only knew. Or maybe you're on the other side. Maybe you're really into rules and you're already on this inside circle. You're saying, listen, I know that's true. I know that it's open for everyone, but really, what about them? Do you really know them? I mean, have you seen how they've hurt people? Have you seen how they hurt me? If you only understood how they offended me, you might not be so quick to let them in. That they've done wrong and they look different. And I think at those times, God would look at us and he's like, oh, yeah, kind of like you were. Kind of like how you offended me. Kind of how like you hurt them. And you're like, wait, what are you talking about? And I think God looks at us and says, yeah, how you see other people and how you say, oh, don't let them in. They're different. They're too far gone. They've gotten too many things wrong in life. They just struggle with all this stuff. It's like you were that to someone else. And mostly you were that to God. You were that to Jesus. But here's part of the good news. Whether you realize that you are bad and you know that you're far off, or whether you think that you're too good and you realize that that's a bad thing, the invitation is still open to everyone, and we are all sinners. We're all on that even playing field, that we have all fallen short. And in fact, being a sinner is a prerequisite to following Jesus. Have you ever thought about that? That being a sinner, being someone who's lost, being someone who's gone, being someone who doesn't get it, is a prerequisite to following Jesus. So if you know that you're a sinner, congratulations, you're halfway there. Being a sinner is a prerequisite to knowing and following Jesus. So, if we just don't want to stay fans, if we just don't want to stay rule followers, how do we actually become followers? That we don't want to just know stuff about God, but we actually want to know him. And that's a hefty feat because we're like, okay, I know I'm imperfect. I know I've messed up, but how do I actually approach this perfect God when I am so imperfect? And the great thing about that is that the way you start to know him, the way that you're brought in, it's not up to you, but it's all of what God has done for us. You're not earning this seat, but you're invited. And it's not based on how good you are. It's based on how good God is. I mean, if you've ever felt like you're not enough, if you've been around people who have looked at you and said, yeah, you're welcome, but with their actions have painted a different story, or maybe you are that person, here's a great testimony that we're going to be looking at that very much felt the same way. This guy Matthew, who was a cheat, who was a failure in his community, who was a thief, who was even worse than a sinner. He was a tax collector. And we know all of this because this is his story. He's sharing this with us. He actually wrote it down. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John for the 4 Gospels. The first guy is Matthew. Matthew wrote down his experience. He wrote down his testimony with Jesus, but not only how it changed his life, but how it changed the lives around him, how he affected other people. So looking in Matthew 9, this is where we're going to be for this morning. Jesus has just healed this paralyzed man. He says, he has this whole thing where he heals a paralyzed man, and the teachers of the law call blasphemy on him. And Jesus looks at them and he says, which is easier, for me to say that his sins are forgiven or to say to get up and walk? And so Jesus does this little miracle where this paralyzed man is now walking. He walks out of the building. And then we're led into this, another interaction of Jesus just being Jesus. And it's been found in Matthew 9:9. It says, as he went from there, after this little miracle that had just happened, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at a tax collector's booth. Follow me. Follow me, he told them, and Matthew got up and followed him. Now, there's so much to unpack in just this little one-sentence verse, and it's like even just trying to imagine this actually happen. I mean, tax collectors didn't have the greatest reputation. They weren't known for their nobility. They weren't known for just being good guys, because they were guys who would, tax their own people on behalf of the Roman government. And on top of that, they would add a little bit more to put in their pockets. And you couldn't really say no because they had muscle behind them. They had the Roman soldiers right there saying, listen, this is how much he's demanding. If you don't pay it, well then something's going to happen. And so this is this guy. This is Matthew. He's stealing from his own people. I mean, this was a man who was probably hated. This was a man who was not welcomed near where all the religious activity happened. This guy was far away. I mean, he was probably kind of ostracized from his family. I mean, his family probably had these big dreams of him working in the temple, of him doing things for God. But yet here he is cheating his own people, making his life wealthy on behalf of other people. And so Jesus comes to him and he says, hey, stop what you're doing and follow me. Everyone, see that tax collector? Watch this. And he simply just says, follow me. And they have to think about the people already following Jesus. Jesus already kind of has like a little crew. He already has like Peter and Andrew and Philip. And they're walking up to this tax collector's booth. And I imagine them thinking to themselves like, oh man, Jesus just healed this guy. He just told the religious leaders off. Now he's going to go up to this tax collector. Oh, I can't wait to hear what he's going to say to this guy. I mean, he's been cheating me for years. And so he walks up to the booth and it's like, wait, Jesus, no. I imagine Peter being like, Philip, what? He didn't say follow me, did he? It's like, I think he did. It's like, no, that can't. He said follow me. And I imagine this going through their heads of like, Jesus, do you know what you're doing? Do you know where he's been? Do you know what he's done? Do you know how he's hurt me? Do you know how he's offended me? I know this invitation is open to everybody, but him? Because I don't think you get it, Jesus. Why would he come with us? He's different. Jesus, I don't think you understand. If he comes with us, that means he's part of the team. And I don't know if I want him part of my team. I mean, your team. Jesus. But this is what Jesus does. He goes to him and he invites him. He invites him to be part of the group. And Jesus didn't start with Matthew's rap sheet. He didn't start with all the things that he was doing wrong. He didn't start with all the things or all the places where he was failing. He simply started with an invitation. He started with relationship. I mean, he knew who Matthew was. He knew what he was doing. He knew of all the things that he was continuously doing. He knew all those things. But he opens the invite to him. And he takes the first step. He says, Matthew, I don't expect you to clean yourself up. I don't expect you to be vulnerable. In fact, I'll do that. I'm going to open up for you to reject me. Hey, Matthew, will you follow me? And now he has the option to say, no, you're crazy. No, do you know who you are? No, I can't do that. Jesus opens it up for him to be rejected. Jesus is the person who's being vulnerable. Jesus is the one asking everything, putting himself on the line and saying, listen, if you associate with me, that's going to make me look a certain way. And I'm willing to do that if you'll follow me. Matthew, this guy who was not noble, not good, had no friends. But guess what he was? He was willing. So Matthew got this invitation, and I don't know what went through his brain. I don't know what happened, but he got up and he followed. And again, I don't know what that conversation looked like. I don't know if Matthew was like, all right, I got my stuff. Where are we going? And Jesus is like, well, we're going where I always go. I don't have a house. We're going to your house. This is like, oh, I should have cleaned. And so this small gathering of people end up going to Matthew's house. And it's so funny because this small gathering actually turns into this huge party. As you continue to read in Matthew 9:10, it says, while Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. I mean, last week we read about these rules and we find ourselves in this religious person's house. And I think it's funny that this week we find ourselves in the exact opposite. You had the religious good person, but now we have the unreligious bad person. And this is where we find Jesus. And at some point in that night, the disciples got too uncomfortable. They were like, man, there's too many tax collectors here. There's too many sinners. We got to get some air. And so they find themselves outside of this party that's now happening, a little overwhelmed. And when they're outside of this party, they find themselves with the religious leaders looking in. And these religious leaders have a question for them. Picking up in verse 11, it says, when the Pharisees saw this, they asked the disciples, they asked Jesus' followers, they asked those who have bought in, and it says, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? What's going on here, guys? And I imagine their kind of response was like, I don't know. We're all new to this. We told him who he was. We told him like his history. We told him what Matthew was really like. And yet he chose to invite him, and we just followed. We just said, Jesus, what would you do in this situation? Okay, I guess we'll do that same thing. We'll go to this tax collector's house. We'll go to this sinner's house. Jesus, I know you kind of march to the beat of your own drum, but we'll follow. And so this is like the part where like it can be so telling of how the church can be, that sometimes we get these hangups of like where people are and how they dress, and we create these barriers for people with Jesus. That we're like, why would anybody do that? Why would anybody invite them? And we're creating these barriers with Jesus. I mean, the religious people, they know their Bibles and they pray and they go to the temple and they're good. They know how to behave, but they're on the outside looking on at what's going on in the inside, where Jesus is, where all the action is. And so you look at this and you might find yourself with similar questions. A heart of, why is he with them and not me? Jesus, I do all the good stuff, right? I pray, I tithe, I serve, I do all those things, but yet you're with them. And I'm sure the Pharisees had somewhat of a heart like that. It's like, disciples, guys, you following Jesus, why is he with them and not us? I don't get it. Why are we outside and they're on the inside? And if you're asking that same question, you might just be a fan. When you've created this division of them versus us, you might have this fan mentality that you're just an admirer, but you don't get it on the inside. You haven't crossed that bridge of creating a relationship. You see, Jesus was uncomfortably comfortable with those who looked and acted nothing like him. I mean, he's with these tax collectors and sinners and hurt people who are hurting people and people who are distant from religion and rules. And yet he finds himself in conversation with them, bringing them in, going to their house, being on the inside. While all these religious people who on the outside kind of resemble Jesus in the fact that they're good, or they know the law, or they go to the temple, all this religious stuff, they're just still caught on the outside wondering, what am I missing? And I love this next part because it's like they're having that conversation outside. The disciples and the Pharisees they're outside asking, why them, not me? And then from the inside of the party, Jesus goes on to yell and he says, on hearing this, Jesus said, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. And imagine that for a second. Like, I imagine Matthew sitting next to Jesus and he's like, wait, Jesus, hey. I know what you just did there. You're basically saying, hey, they're not sick, but we are. I think I know what you're saying. And I imagine Jesus at that point being like, Matthew, you're a tax collector. Of course you're sick. Like, you steal from people. Like, you're shortcoming your own family. Like, of course you're sick. You need a doctor. You know this. And Matthew be like, yeah, I guess you're right. Got all these sinners here. And for fun, I just imagine that. And like Matthew's like, yeah, I still offensive, but yeah, I get your heart behind it. I see where you're coming from. Matthew, the tax collector. But like sometimes we're in the same boat. That we hear, hey, they're sick, but it's like, do we understand that we're sick? Do we understand that we're the sinner, that we might get offended at that? And we say, hey, not me, but them. But really, think about that you're in that same boat as Matthew, that if you're on the inside of this party, that Jesus is saying, listen, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, it's the sick, it's us, it's we, it's you. Because think about it. I mean, we can't even meet our own standards. We don't even meet those things that we say people ought to do. People ought not to do this. People ought not to do that. And no matter what age you are, whether you're a teen, a young adult to the adults, wherever you're at, you make these standards that you can't even keep. You find yourselves not doing these things, or you find yourself doing the things that you shouldn't do on purpose. And what do you call that? It's not a mistake. Some people might say it's sin. And Jesus says, one of the last things for these religious people on the outside, he says to them this. He says, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but the sinners. And this is really what I think Jesus is saying in this moment. He's saying, listen, I just don't want fans. I don't want admirers who want, all the benefits but no sacrifice. I don't want to surround myself with people who just believe the right things and know how to behave the right way. No, he says, I want more than that. I just don't want those things, but I want people who are willing. Jesus wants those who are willing to hear the invitation and follow. Yeah, hey, you're a sinner, right? Yeah. Well, you're halfway there. It's a prerequisite to following me. Hey, you might have questions, right? Yeah, I have some questions. Great. Everything might not make sense to you, but if you're willing to follow, I'll have some answers for you. If you're willing to follow, I got some things for you. You don't have to truly understand everything that's going on, but trust me, if you're willing, things are going to change for you. Just follow me. So we might look at Jesus and be like, okay, Jesus, I get it. Like, I'm a sinner, I have questions, and you're inviting me to follow, but where are you leading me? Like, what is this invitation to? Where am I going to follow you to? And I think about that for a second. It's like, God, okay, this is the big jump for us, right? Like, okay, I think I'm willing, but where are you leading me? That's the scary part. I don't know where that's going to happen. And I want to know the answer before I make that jump, because then there's some security in that. I can say, okay, if you're leading me down there, then I'll say no to that because I don't want to do that. But Jesus just says, follow me. I can't tell you where I'm leading you, but you just got to trust me. And you just got to follow. And so this invitation of what Jesus is following to, before I jump into that, before I lead us there, I want to ask this question, or I want to kind of address those in the room who are already Jesus followers, who understand the answer, who know where this invitation leads to. Jesus' followers, his disciples, because you know where the invitation leads. You know where that goes. You might know what that looks like, but let this be a reminder. Just stop for a second and let this be a reminder that we don't want to be a people. We don't want to be a congregation. We don't want to be a church who is content with just believing and behaving the right way. That's just a fan. That if you call yourself a Jesus follower, if you call yourself a Christian, if you call yourself someone who's like, yeah, I just want to do everything that Jesus does, this is your reminder to not be content as a people who are just believing the right things and behaving the right way. That we are all sick and we are all sinners, but yet we found our way because of where Jesus led us, because of this invitation. And if we are content with those things, then we'll be found on the outside of this party asking, why them and not me? So back to this invitation. What is this invitation to? The invitation is to relationship. What Jesus is inviting us to is to this invitation of relationship. And the reason why it's not solid is because relationship changes. It looks different all the time. In fact, relationships are messy and they take time and they take commitment. But here's the great news about God, is that he has taken all of the first steps. In relationship, it takes, that second to be vulnerable, but yet God has already been vulnerable. In relationships, it's messy, but God says, I'm willing to be messy. In relationship, it takes love and commitment, and God's like, I'm willing to do that. Listen, I love you exactly where you are, but I'm also committed not to leave you there. And it's this whole mess, this open invitation of love and commitment that's open for everyone, which means it's open to anyone. So to find out exactly, or maybe you need a refresher of what this messy, over time commitment of a relationship looks like, well, you have to come back next week. God, we just love you and we thank you and we pray that this open invitation, God, that we would understand it, that it's open to everyone and anyone, that we were those people who had offended, that we were those people who had hurt, and yet you still invited us, God. And I pray that we would be people who follow this invitation, who accept this invitation and say, God, what is it that you would do? Because that's what I want to do. That we would not be content with just believing the right things and behaving the right way, but that we would be heartbroken for the world around us and would cause us to move. That we would actually love our neighbors, that we would serve, not to serve ourselves, but just really serve the people around us. That ultimately glorifies you. So we love you and we thank you. And all God's children said,